thanks all of you for coming. Again, I think it's been said before, but if you have questions, please submit them through the app, and I can get them here up on stage. As Michael said, we had a very exciting lunch, but actually, we have a very exciting panel. I'm going to start with a country that, so we're in the United States, a country that's not been in the news very much lately, which is Turkey. Nobody's really been talking about it at all. So, so I wanted to talk to Hakan and do two things. One is I'm going to give kind of, I think, what would be a standard question for you, which is the central bank has taken some fairly substantial steps over the last, in the very recent past, to try to push Turkey's growth forward because it has been suffering lately. How is your financial institution adapting to this? And if you have time and inclination, it would be great for you to comment on how the U.S.-Turkey relationship is going from your perspective.
Okay.
You don't have to answer that one.
So let me start with the macro. Probably it is easier for me to respond, but I'll also share my opinion about the other subject as well. So this year, actually, things are relatively much better. So we had 2 tough years, 2018, at the beginning of 2019. But when you look at the macro today, I think the trend is much more positive. First of all, inflation is coming down. So last year, it was very high, like 20s. So when you look at it today, especially September, October, inflation, it is down to a single-digit number, which is around 9%. And we forecast that by the end of this year, it will be around 12%. So that actually gives the central bank a lot of room for rate cuts. So when you look at our existing policy rate, it is around 16.5. So if we imagine that inflation is around 12% by the end of the year, so still there's a room for further rate cuts. So it's a bit, difficult to estimate, but I would imagine that somewhere like 200 basis, 250 basis. I think this is possible, still leaving some space for real interest rates. So this is one positive development. The second development is more on the current account deficit side, which is really the soft part of our economy. So it used to be as high as like minus 58 billion US, but when you look at it today, there's a surplus. So currently there is roughly $5.5 billion surplus. So that's another positive development. But when the growth picks up again, probably it will be a negative number, but it's not as big as before. So this is another positive development. And there is effects of the corporates are deleveraging on the FX loans, so that is positive. That they are reducing their actually FX exposures. So in the short term, their FX exposure is actually, it's not a negative number anymore, so it's plus 10 billion US. So these are pretty good developments. What is lacking is the growth. So this year, so the growth will be around 0%, maybe zero-ish, let me say, 0.5%, something like this. So hopefully, starting from the next year, there will be more growth. So this environment is positive for the banks, declining interest rate environment, because nowadays there is a big, margin expansion. So maybe we don't have significant growth that as we used to have before, but the margins are getting better. So I'm more positive looking forward. We have been provisioning a lot, so that's good actually. So we have a lot of accumulated provision, so that's pretty good. So the trend is positive. And coming back to the other side. First of all, I think there is some miscommunication and disconnect, actually, what Turkey was trying to do and the understanding in the international world. Actually, what Turkey is trying to do is something very simple. First of all, we would like to have a safer border with Syria, because there was a lot of import of terrorism, which the country suffered a lot. So that was actually one reason. And the second reason, actually, we have now 4 million refugees in the country. So that happened because of the humanitarian issues, like several years back. But I mean, you would imagine that it's not really easy to support 4 million people. So educational needs, health needs, employment needs. So that is actually costing a lot to the country. And unfortunately, Turkey had a feeling, and which was the reality, I think, felt alone in coping with those big issues. And what Turkey tried to do was to bring again those people to their original location. So Turkey tried to do that with the international community, especially with the US, with the allies. There was a lot of negotiation, but apparently it didn't happen. So the country had to do it itself. But I'm so happy about the developments, yesterday. I mean, there is no doubt about it. Turkey, part of the Western world, ally with the U.S., Western friends, and so on. So there's no issue about this. So there's no issue about Kurdish people in general. So there is an issue with a certain fragment, which is PKK and the arm of PKK, and I think there's a common understanding in the international world as well. And it's a positive development.
Thank you very much. Thank you for taking that question on, too. Rania, I'm going to stay in your region. And so there's also been geopolitical tensions that have affected, oil markets. And as a leader in financial institution in Saudi Arabia, how are you seeing both the markets and how's your outlook going forward?
Okay. First of all, with regards to the recent attacks on the oil tanks at Aramco, this is really not acceptable by all means, but it's proven that the country was able to recover and to get the oil production back to the normal level. With regards to geopolitical issues, our country is being surrounded by all this tension throughout the last 3 or 4 decades, starting from Iraq-Iran war, the Gulf War II, the war in Yemen, in Syria, the Arab Spring. So our economy used to react to those tensions, and it's proven throughout the year its resilience. Now, with the announcement of the Vision 2030, which is the roadmap for our country, and it actually helps to mitigate the risks of the vulnerability of the oil prices through having more income stream for our national GDP through the non-oil economy. And this actually will help towards having more stable economy. The reaction that we are seeing and the feedback on the Vision 2030 implementation is really showing things are on track. We have the ability always to go back and check and do the performance measurement and then go back on track again. Our national GDP is showing growth. Yes, it's low, but it's happening. So we are very positive about the outlook of the economy. With regards to our bank on the day of the attack of Aramco, just the next day we were raising bond, and it was like oversubscribed 6 times. And this really shows the international investors' trust in our economy, because 73% of that bond was invested by European and Asian investors.
Well, thank you very much. And Sim, so I'm going to switch region a little. So over the last few years, South Africa has faced low economic growth and high unemployment. What will it take in your country, you think, to boost economic growth and to make it more sustainable over the medium term? And at the same time, how does your financial institution adjust as you're in a low growth environment, I guess?
Clay, thank you very much for that question. You are correct that in the first quarter of this year, the South African economy had a 3.2 negative growth. In the second quarter, it was 3.1%, and the negative in the first quarter was as a consequence of electricity challenges in the country. And in fact, those electricity challenges bespeak a serious structural problem and a serious structural opportunity as well in the country. GDP per capita declined between 2011 and this year by 25% as a consequence of the weakening of the rand, a slowdown in the economy, but an increase in population growth. And so we're in a tough position. When the president got elected, CDS spreads in the country went from 250 basis points down to 140, and it was a period called Ramaphoria. His name is Ramaphosa. Great euphoria because of the promise, and therefore a lot of confidence in the country. They then declined. They went back to 250, and over time they've been improving. They're currently at around 180, which is about the right level that they should be at the moment. What needs to be done? The first thing is that, Clay, you being an American, you will appreciate John Adams' statement that this is a country of laws, not of men. Mm-hmm. And the same applies to South Africa. It's a country that has got strong regulatory environment, mm-hmm. strong laws, a decent judiciary, and very disciplined institutions, ranging from the courts to the Electoral Commission, to the business community, to the churches, to the trade union movement. So very, very strong institutions. Strong policy making and strong financial management. We've got one of the best central banks in the world, and we are known for transparency in our fiscal processes. The structural reforms that need to take place, they range from improving the electricity structure of the country, improving logistics, releasing the spectrum so that you reduce the cost of data, improving those sectors of the economy that are labor intensive, such as agriculture and tourism. Important to change the leadership of many of the state-owned enterprises, particularly the biggest one, the utility, which is Eskom, mm-hmm. And a range of structural reforms along these lines. What is pleasing is that the authorities have started to take action, and we're starting to see the benefits of that. One data point which suggests that things are starting to happen is that we've improved our position in the World Economic Forum competitiveness report by 7 places, and I think there's more to come as these structural reforms are taken. As a bank, we grew at half year our headline earnings by 6% in an environment where you had decline in GDP growth, and we continued to improve our revenues, managed our costs tightly, but a large vector of growth in our case was the fact that we operate in 20 African countries, many of which are growing at rates of above 6%. Sub-Saharan growth is around 3.2% at the moment. Perhaps let me stop there. It's a great neighborhood to be in, is the point.
Okay. Yeah, well, thank you. And speaking of great neighborhoods, Fareed, I'm turning to you. I'd like to hear your thoughts about how Malaysia is doing, your financial institution, and maybe a little broader about the ASEAN region itself.
Okay. First and foremost, we are primarily in Malaysia, Singapore, and Indonesia. We are present in all the 10 countries in ASEAN, but 90% of our business are actually in these 3 countries. Malaysia just had a sort of a historical moment last year when the incumbent government, who had been ruling for 52 years, got defeated in the general election. So the current government, who is now managing the country, who used to be opposition for 52 years, I think they're still trying to adjust. I think sometimes they forget that they are no longer opposition, that they are actually the ruling government. But having said that, the economy that we're facing in Malaysia, in Singapore, in Indonesia, and the rest of ASEAN is no different from what the rest of us are facing around the world. The impact of the trade tension between US and China is very real for us. Some are good, some are bad. From a perspective of trade, China and US are actually the biggest trading partners for the countries in the region. But at the same time, when there was a relocation of the supply chain of some of the businesses, actually some of the countries from South Asia actually benefited from that, Vietnam being the biggest beneficiary of all. For us, as a financial institution, the problems, the issues are quite similar, but not necessarily identical, because we have been looking at the economy growing, where we see loan growth as a multiple of GDP growth. But GDP growth has slowed down. As you know, capex cycle actually has not rebounded, and therefore the multiplier of GDP, loan to GDP growth is no longer there. So what we see mostly around the region, growth is primarily a one-time with GDP growth, and we're talking about a region that's growing about 5%. And when we have a 5% GDP growth and loan growth at about that rate, in managing threat from technology players, in managing costs that we need to spend on compliance, costs that we need to spend on risk management, and now looking at ESG, it's a very difficult balancing act, And to top it all, for financial institutions have been used to a growth of multiple of GDP. Now they see that the loan growth has slowed down, and everybody is becoming sometimes irrational, throwing prices around, and therefore we see compression of NIM. And I'm sure this is in everywhere. So it is a challenge that I also notice happening everywhere else, including in the United States. The challenge of how do you manage our sustainability going forward when growth is pretty limited.
Thank you. And now turning actually to this part of the world, Juan Carlos. So Colombia has often been sort of a stable place in a sometimes volatile region. And over the last few years, we have seen, though, the current account deficit has started to expand, even as the peso has depreciated a lot. I'm not saying Colombia is on the verge of a financial crisis, but is there concern within Colombia that it's going to be harder to achieve economic growth, or that there's going to be more vulnerabilities in the financial system which could back up and hurt your financial institution?
Clay, as you mentioned, Colombia has been a pretty stable country in Latin America. And your question about the current account deficit, it's not really something that it's creating some worries in Colombia. I mean, the deficit is high now, but we think it's more caused by some companies that invested in Colombia that are sending dividends away from Colombia. The currency devaluated, as you mentioned, and that's going to do part of the adjustment. So I think for Colombia now, it's more, we need to focus more on inflation, which is at the highest part of the corridor set by the central bank. It's close to 3.8%, and it should be more towards 3%. So inflation is something that probably is causing some concern. Also exports, how to develop the exports in Colombia. Other than that, the country is doing well. GDP is going to grow around 3% this year, which is good for the Latin American context. Yeah. The forecast for next year is around 3.5. So economic activity is there, internal consumption is healthy. So on that environment, banks are doing well. I mean, this year, the results of the bank are good. They are growing, or we are growing. The loan portfolios are growing. The demand is there. So in that environment, I think we are doing pretty well. The other challenges for Colombia, it's some structural reforms that the country needs, and those are pension, labor reform, and fiscal reform that need to go through Congress. So those probably are more structural challenges that the country has, especially about the labor law. There is a lot of informality in Colombia, and modernizing the labor law, I think, is something that is very important for the development of the country. The other countries in which we operate, which are Panama, El Salvador, and Guatemala, are also doing well. They are growing around also 3%. So we are in a region that is volatile, but in the countries that we are operating are doing well.
Thank you. And Juan Carlos, you mentioned kind of some internal structural issues that affect Colombia. So I'm going to turn back to you, Hakan, because I got a question from the audience, which is basically, how does Turkey deal with the increasing NPL in the banking system? Do you see that as a problem that's going to continue, or do you think that Turkey's kind of the government and the banks themselves are getting on top of this and they're going to weed out the NPL issue so it won't affect too badly balance sheets?
First of all, we switched to IFRS 9 as of 2018. And with IFRS 9, banks started to provision before loans turn into stage 3 NPL. So we started creating these buffers for the last roughly 2 years. Just to give you an example, in my institution, we have provisioned like roughly 6 billion as of last year, and this year again a similar figure. So if a loan, if you do your IFRS 9 implementation properly, if a loan switches from stage 2 to stage 3, basically you don't have a P&L impact. So we really like this IFRS 9. So it really prepares the institution for tougher times.
Okay.
So if you ask my opinion, I think from the provisioning point of view, I think this is something I can say in general. There might be differences between institutions, but in general, I think 2018 and 19, I would imagine that these were the worst years for the banking system. So in our case, for example, hopefully starting from the next year, it will probably start to come down again. So that is my prediction. At least this will be the case in our case. And also the Turkish banking system to start with was pretty strong actually. I mean, even if you look at it today, despite all those provisioning and so on, still the capital adequacy ratio of the system is above 17%.
Okay.
So this is quite a high figure,
yeah.
And it can absorb, even if there are some difficulties, still, it has the capability to absorb this. Liquidity-wise, it is actually pretty solid. So there's no problem in getting from loans from outside. Actually, banks have been deleveraging. So if you look at the FX borrowing from outside, all these syndications, loans and so on, the rollover ratio was actually far below 100. So it was in the range of like 70, 75, 80. So actually banks deleveraged at the magnitude of more than 30 billion US over the last 9 months or so. So I am also more positive looking forward because we have been really doing a lot of provisioning and so on.
Okay, thank you. So I wanted to hit on some external forces. So Fareed talked a little bit about the U.S.-China trade tension and how it's affecting this part of the world. But I'm going to switch it up a little bit, and Sim, I'm going to go to you, which is to talk about the Belt and Road Initiative. And I mean, when you sitting here in Washington, we think of that as just a big challenge. But I'm decently smart enough to know that there's also probably some really good opportunities as well through the Belt and Road Initiative. What does it mean for your country, and maybe for your institution specifically?
Clay, I think we have a subsidiary in Uganda. It's called Stanbic. It's the largest bank in Uganda. And I have the privilege of having to travel there from time to time. And when I used to travel there, the road between Kampala and the airport was amongst the worst and most hazardous pieces of infrastructure you can imagine. I was there a couple of months ago, and the road is now pristine. It's almost like driving between Vermont and Boston.
Yeah.
That's how beautiful the road is. And that road was built by a Chinese consortium and funded by Chinese funders. We had the privilege of participating in that transaction. We provided some of the structuring and some of the payments. Uganda is built to grow at above 5% for the medium term. The economy is diversifying. They've discovered oil. And so you can imagine the combination of improved infrastructure, improved hard infrastructure, but also the improvement in soft infrastructure. That is then a combination of the provision of funding, the provision of infrastructure that is necessary for the build-out of the economy in Uganda. And it is a story that is replicated in many parts of the African continent, that relationship between Chinese corporates and African governments. The tragedy, though, of the story is that many transactions are poorly negotiated, with the consequence that Africans lose out of those processes. And the lesson to learn from that, and certainly a lesson that we've learned, is that you've got to negotiate properly. You've got to negotiate and make sure that there's no environmental degradation. And in fact, Chinese corporates are very open to those discussions and negotiations. You've got to negotiate vigorously about labor. You've got to negotiate vigorously about costs and so forth. And if you negotiate appropriately, you get the appropriate transactions. I might just conclude by pointing out that we have been participating in several transactions that involve Chinese corporates that are interested in the build of infrastructure on the African continent. And we have made a lot of money from those transactions, but we felt that the processes have been fair. Let me close this point by saying that the Belt Road Initiative and the build of African infrastructure will definitely result in some exciting outcomes. You've got a population of 1.2 billion people. They're young, they're getting healthier, they're getting wealthier, and therefore greater consumption. You've got cities that are growing very fast. At least a quarter of the world's top 100 cities are going to be from the African continent. There's a statistic that people don't often realize. If you ask this room how many billion-dollar companies exist on the African continent, you'll be lucky if you get half the room believing that it's about 50. And yet, it's over 400. And so there's an exciting story to tell of opportunities for companies that face consumers and corporates and people that are interested in the build-out of infrastructure.
So Fareed, I'm going to come back to you. So Sim points out that yes, there's tensions that come from these external forces, but there's also some good opportunities as well. How is it in Malaysia? Especially, I mean, the U.S.-China relationship is fraught, and it's having an effect, as you mentioned earlier. Maybe you can go a little further into that, but you also could see that maybe there's some opportunities there popping up partially because of this tension and partially because of the external role that China's playing.
Yeah, I just want to pick up from what Sim was saying because a lot of this counterparty arrangement that we have, no matter who's on the other side, it all depends on how we negotiate the agreements, right? And we had a bit of that as well, also under the BRI, which later on got renegotiated to lower the amount by 25%. I'm talking about the East Coast railroad that's being built in Peninsular Malaysia, which is meant to develop the Western Corridor, which up to this point has been growing on the basis of tourism alone, and therefore this project will allow industries to get into that corridor. So in a way, it's positive from that perspective. I remember looking at Duterte when he was running for president, and there was a lot of accusation that he was kowtowing to the Chinese. But if you imagine that you're running a country, and part of the formula for you to manage the economy is that if your FDI is not growing, you need to work on some party to help to grow the FDI. In this case, I think the Chinese is providing for them. So of course we need to negotiate on the right terms, and at the same time we need to make sure that we are neutral when it comes to dealing with United States and China. But in terms of managing the economy, this is something that they have to do. So from that perspective, if you take a look at that point, in the absence of that in the pie, there would have been a gap. In Africa, there would have been a gap in South Asia, because nobody else was present. Everybody else was everywhere else. So we need to grow, right?
Yep.
So.
Juan Carlos, I'm going to combine two questions together here. One that comes from the audience, and one I was thinking about related to the external spillovers, but I think I can combine them in not a totally convoluted way. So there's been spillover because of the crisis in Venezuela into Colombia. And it's clearly having an effect, I would assume, on your economy to a certain extent, and maybe onto your fiscal side. The audience question was that there's been some improvement in the institutional framework for infrastructure, but progress on roads programs seems a bit slower than has been hoped for. Is the spillover going to have an impact on the ability of the government to help address the concerns of the people of Colombia for their infrastructure? Because now you have to deal with this problem, this humanitarian problem that has now come onto your shores, so to speak.
Clay, let me start by saying that the world has not realized the humanitarian crisis that is going on in Venezuela. In just Colombia, there are 1.4 million Venezuelans that migrate to Colombia looking for opportunities, basically to survive. That's 1.4 million people just in Colombia, and in all South America, around 3 million. So it's massive.
Yep.
And what is happening in Venezuela is really a humanitarian crisis. Saying that Colombia is receiving this migration, of course it has an effect. We calculate that providing healthcare, education to this amount of people, it's costing Colombia around 0.3–0.4% of the Colombian GDP. So it's a big investment. But saying that Venezuelans are integrating in the Colombian economy pretty well. I mean, there are effects on unemployment, which is rising, but the country is handling pretty well so far. And we believe that this is going to have a positive midterm effect. People that are coming to Colombia are, many of them, well-educated, young. So the human capital that is coming to Colombia is going to provide a boost in the midterm to Colombia. But meanwhile, it's putting some pressure on the fiscal side, as you mentioned. And with your question related to that is infrastructure. Colombia is a country that needs a lot of infrastructure. And the last government put in place a very ambitious program of building roads. It was an investment of around $50 billion on roads. And the projects started, and there will be issues around the construction of those projects. Some of them related to corruption. But the program is moving forward. And basically what is happening is that banks are financing part of that local banks and other international banks and the government. It's moving slower than we thought, and actually what the country needs. But we think that with the lessons that we have learned during this period, this is going to move forward in the future, and Colombia is going to advance. And many of the roads are going to be finished in the next 3 to 4 years of the first stage of that ambitious program. So with that, I think it's going to have an example that Colombia can build infrastructure, and we will keep moving forward. It's going to take a long time, but Colombia will build the infrastructure that need to keep developing.
Clay, can I just say one thing? Sorry, Rania. Taman Shanmugam gave a speech during lunchtime yesterday, and he said that in Singapore, we have to give a damn about what's happening with the neighbors. You have to help to enrich Thai neighbor. Otherwise, this issue is going to continue to happen again. So for all of us, we do have some sort of responsibility to help the community around us, right?
Right.
So, this refugee issue is a big issue, and nobody is actually paying enough attention to it, and it's going to keep on growing if we don't deal with it.
It's a very good point, and Hakan was making the same point about what's been happening in Turkey as well.
Yes, international cooperation is very important. I mean, just having this burden by a single nation, I think it's not fair. Probably it's the case with Colombia.
Same
as
case.
well.
And Rania, this is a question also from the audience. So it is, what is your views on the consolidation and the mergers and acquisitions in the Saudi market? How do you see that going forward, I guess?
The mergers and acquisitions that we are having now 2 banks that are merging, and they've already completed their merger, and 2 other banks are in the process of merging, which will create 2 giants. If you see the ambitions of our Vision 2030 and the Saudi economic growth plans, it doesn't really tally with the capacity of the current banking system. And that's why the government has opened the door for even foreign banks to come and open branches, and they establish business in Saudi Arabia, because we are considered an underbanked country compared to the economy size and the aspiration for our economy. For us as a bank that is looking at these mergers, we're seeing it more of an opportunity for us rather than challenges, because this will bring us more opportunities from the customers who are going, to look for other banks due to the concentration risk that if they are banking with both of those merged banks. So we're seeing, more customers are coming. We're looking into the workforces there. So we see it more of an opportunity. We see large balance sheets that we can collaborate with these banks and leverage on their balance sheets. So we see it more of an opportunity rather than risk on our bank.
Thank you very much. I notice we're out of time. I want to thank the panel for being not just willing to talk about some of the normal issues, but willing to go a little bit deeper on some of the tougher issues that we all face. So thank you very much for being here.
Thank you.